Well, hello and welcome to the first ever installment of Pop Poetry's video interview series, Poets Go Pop. Today I'm interviewing the one and only Jenny Molberg about her poetry and her interest in Stranger Things and all things Demogorgon. Jenny is not only a badass poet and the author of Marvels of the Invisible, got that right here, from Tupelo Press, which was published in 2017, and Refusal from LSU Press, published last year in 2020. She's also one of my very best friends, so I am a very lucky lady, and I'm very excited to talk to Jenny today. On Poets Go Pop, I am diving into the work of living poets right here who work with pop culture in their poetry in one way or another to pick their brains and figure out what it all means, man. So Jenny, welcome to Poets Go Pop.
Thanks, Caitlin. I'm so excited to have this conversation with you.
I know, this is so exciting. I'm really glad to have you on here and to talk about your work and just all things Stranger Things. Recently, Jenny very graciously used one of my posts at PopPoetry in a class she was teaching. What was that like?
Oh, I mean, thank you for that, because what I'm going to do in the fall when I teach a longer, because this was like a 6-week summer course. So I only really had time to use one, but I'd like to structure a whole class, sort of like returning back to the idea of pop culture and poetry, because I think it's really accessible for the students, for my students. We all watch a lot of TV, you know, and I think it's cool for them to see poetry as a living thing. Like you said, I mean, you know, you're talking about living poets. And I think that oftentimes our students are taught in high school, no offense to high school teachers, and often they're not, but a lot of times they're taught that like poetry is this, you know, long dead art, that it's this like high art, that it's inaccessible, that it can't relate to its own time, that it's like universal and large and sometimes archaic. So a lot of times my students are writing poems using archaic language, and I want to say like, no, you can throw in a reference to like your favorite band or the movies that you're watching.
Yeah.
And because you're, you know, as a practicing poet, you're speaking, well, you're both writing for yourself, but you're also speaking to the contemporary audience. And so, you know, you're having a conversation. So I think that I love like what you do, because I think it makes us recognize and see, sort of like opens our eyes to like the commonplace nature of poetry.
That is high praise. I hope that I am doing that. Thank you. Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned high art versus low art, because I think that I also, you know, coming up as a poet, kind of personally intuited the idea that popular culture was not a fit subject for poetry, because poetry was so sort of highfalutin. And there's still a lot of discussion about that happening out there in the ether. I mean, I think that just for one example, Martin Scorsese complaining about how Marvel movies are ruining cinema is sort of a silly kind of argument that's actually pretty unproductive and kind of anti-art. Do you have any sort of like opinions about that sort of false dichotomy of high and low art? Do you believe in such a thing, or what does that kind of mean to you?
I think these days, when we're doing a lot of the important work of challenging like classism, racism, sexism, I think that it's important to always interrogate and question statements like that, because like who is it silencing? And you know, what does it mean for someone to have the authority over what art is important art and what is not? And that's a huge conversation that we might like kind of touch on, I think, tonight, because it's like, you know, like what illusions can you make? Like, how can people access your work? How can you access your own work? Like who does that exclude, you know? And like, why is that productive for the practice of art?
Yeah. I mean, illusions that students might not get now in, you know, the Odyssey or something like that, they would have spoken perhaps to an audience of that time, but we're not that audience anymore. And so you bringing in, you know, Thor, Spider-Man, you know, it could have a different valence. But Marvel characters are not the major subject that crops up in your book, Refusal. One character that does pop up a lot again in this book, which is just so beautiful, is the Demogorgon, and I've seen you at readings give out kind of Stranger Things swag, like pins and stickers, to try to connect those ideas. I always get jealous that poets don't have enough swag, and I like that you do, little tokens and things like that. But I mean, the Demogorgon is a figure that's almost as old as time. Were you directly engaging a Stranger Things sort of reference in those poems, or was its appearance in the culture kind of a coincidence at the time you were writing the book?
So I did not realize that the Demogorgon had such like a rich literary history. Like the Demogorgon appears in early Christian literature and in Milton, and I didn't realize that. What I was doing was playing a lot of Dungeons and Dragons.
That's awesome.
I had moved to Kansas City. I had come out of a bad relationship, and I was trying to build community, and Stranger Things and Dungeons and Dragons kind of went hand in hand. I started playing Dungeons and Dragons, and then I realized, like, oh, Stranger Things, this speaks to a lot about my interests. Like, this is like an emblem of my childhood. It's an homage to like all of my favorite childhood films, like Stand By Me and like Alien, you know? And, but also I think that once I started thinking about watching the show and playing Dungeons and Dragons, and started thinking about like the archetypes that both of those pieces of pop culture, just one is like basically from the 80s and one is honoring the 80s, the archetypes that they're creating and speaking towards like really related to my situation in terms of abuse and trauma. And I had set out to write about my relation, like my family dynamic, and you know, everything filters in, right? Like then I was also writing about the trauma of like a divorce and an abusive relationship, and I kept watching Stranger Things and seeing these like archetypes and thinking like especially with 11 as a character, you know, thinking about how her silencing and her limitations and her isolation were something I deeply understood, which was kind of a strange experience, because I'm like, how can I relate to this character who, you know, like has the powers of telekinesis and stuff. But I think she really spoke to me. And then the Demogorgon kind of did in their own way too. Yeah.
Yeah, so it sounds like you were in the process with some ideas and poems, and Stranger Things was kind of reinforcing what you were working on, just experiencing it by watching it. That's really interesting. The first time that we encounter the Demogorgon, which if you don't know what on earth we're talking about, pause the video, open up a new tab, Google Demogorgon and get freaked out, and then come back here and let's talk about how the first time we meet the Demogorgon in your book, it's through a poem called The Love Song of the Demogorgon. So this is a monster that we're dealing with. And then you've also got an epigraph by Shelley at the head of this poem. Can you talk a little bit about that poem? I'd love to have you read it too, if you'd like.
Yeah, maybe I'll read it first and then I'll talk a little bit about it. Okay, The Love Song of Demogorgon. And also, like, the Demogorgon poems were the last poems I wrote for the book. And I think I felt like it was needing some extension outwards, like some sort of interrogation of like, in a societal or cultural way, like what the things that I was writing about personally meant. And the Demogorgon was like such the right vessel for that. But okay, The Love Song of Demogorgon, and the epigraph from Shelley, it's from Prometheus Unbound, and it reads, "Hither the sound has borne us to the realm of Demogorgon and the mighty portal." The Love Song of Demogorgon. Love is the world reversed. Nothing but a scribble in a drizzling cave. Good Christians do not speak my name, but still I rise inside your body, slither amphibian from your lips. Don't look at me. I'm chaos. Despite the bit of earth left in me, I resemble nothing. Face like a starfish, fingers like rodents in flight. My mind made of two minds, I change. Two-headed ruler of a twofold world. The higher mind flays me, that shadow box I play inside. I, its mean puppet, moving by night. Come for me with your nail-studded bat. I will make you do the most terrible things.
It's beautiful. Thank you for that.
Thanks, Caitlin. Yeah, I was thinking, I think, in a larger way, the Demogorgon in that book is emblematic of the abuser. Mm-hmm. And this poem references the higher mind, or the mind flayer in Stranger Things, which is this like giant creature that is a hive mind that controls all the Demogorgons. Also at one point, Will, the sort of protagonist, right? And I thought of that as like a symbol of toxic masculinity, like our social and cultural ideas about like what masculinity is, and also power. And then the Demogorgons seem to me, they're like minions, but they're also like people in smaller positions of power, always threatening acts of violence. So using that larger threat, that in some ways we're all taught to sort of abide, to control.
So this is a love song, but it's not the kind of love that you want. It's dangerous.
I was trying to do this exercise like psychologically, where I tried to have empathy for my abuser, right? Like I was trying to extend some sort of understanding or empathy, which is difficult to do. And so that's where this poem came from, because I was trying to be like, okay, like if the Demogorgon, instead of just making it this like monster outside that like has no dimension, like what would it be like to get inside his mind?
Yeah, we've talked about that, haven't we? We've talked about the mental exercise of flipping the tables, of what if for a moment, we imagine that the most horrible feature of our lives is misunderstood by us.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think, we, not to speak for you at all, but like I at least, did that with my own father for a while in poetry. Like came into it being angry and writing these poems that came out a little bit like one-dimensional, because I wasn't at least making the effort to extend empathy, or like interrogating the possibility of empathy, which I think is what like one of the best things that poems can do.
Yeah.
Sometimes it fails.
A Demogorgon can sing a love song or speak. I think that's amazing. And I do like the mind flare element of this, or like the hive mind. I don't know how much Marvel you do take in, but I just saw Black Widow recently. Have you seen that? Or are you into that sort of a thing? Well, I might entice you to it by telling you that one of the themes is mind control as a kind of pretty clear for me allegory of patriarchy.
Yeah.
And it's literalized in a really specific way, but yeah, it's
I'll watch it. I haven't gotten into Marvel, but I've been sort of like curious. I feel like I didn't at first, and now I feel like an outsider, like I don't understand it. So
this is the one, I'm telling you. I think
okay.
I'll enjoy it. But yeah, that's amazing. Thank you so much for reading that poem. So we kind of talked about it, but do you want to say any more about, why the Demogorgon in particular fascinates you as a poet? I've, doing a little, digging myself, have learned that the Demogorgon as a piece of language, word Demogorgon, may have developed through a misreading of a transcription in an ancient text from the word demiurge, which to me kind of has an inroad to poets and poetry and what poets do as creators. Is that something that you ever try to engage, or what else, fascinates you about the figure itself?
Yeah, I'm really interested in that, because I think a lot of references to the Demogorgon in early texts are like spelled differently, or like in some cases, like it may be like a demigod. There's also like different iterations of the Demogorgon, like we'll see the one in Stranger Things, like the face like a corpse flower, like the face like a starfish, like a, you know, but then they're also like in Dungeons and Dragons, the Demogorgon has two heads. Melville describes the Demogorgon, like describes the white whale as a Demogorgon, which I think is interesting.
Oh, it's been so long since I read that. That's fascinating.
Yeah. I don't know. The only other thing I was thinking about when you asked this question, when I was reading over your questions before, was like, you know, what it means to turn to pop culture or myth or fiction of any kind, basically, as like a way into something resembling confession in poetry. Like, because I was thinking a lot about this earlier today, like why write these poems? Like, what does this mean? Why is this here? I'm always thinking of ways to like extend beyond the personal. And I'm always challenging the idea of confessional poetry. But one thing I was thinking about that I think is important is like the element of safety, like that pop culture, like allusions or references can create, because yeah, if you're writing confessional work, like sometimes that can be like emotionally or psychologically unsafe, like even as a practice. And like you're saying your like most unsayable things, you know? But also like as poets, I think we're always trying to like find the way in, like find the way into the poem. You know, we talk about like inspiration or like muse, which I kind of hate that term and want to destroy it. But like, you know, like we're looking for ways to engage with something so that we can kind of like work through what's concerning us or what we're obsessed with. And I think that, so not only can confessional writing about trauma be emotionally unsafe, but it can be literally unsafe. And I think that in like workshop, like, what happens when, sorry, is my internet connection okay?
It was touch and go, but now I think you're good. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So like, okay, so confessional poetry, right? Like what happens when you're writing about people who have harmed you or who you have harmed even in your life, and like they're living people, they're living, breathing people, and they encounter your work. And like with some people, like our parents or our family members, sometimes they can like forgive and be like, that's your story, that's okay, I understand, this is your way of processing it. With some people too, like they can read your work and feel angered or hurt or upset by it. And then there's like, if that person created trauma in your life, there's like a real life risk. So like using pop culture, using illusion, using mythological figure is like a way to sort of like speak your truth through something recognizable that like both protects the poet and makes it larger and more accessible.
I really like that. Yeah, it's sort of doing double duty. It's helping you facilitate understanding in the reader, but also it's sort of like that idea that there's comfort television. Have you heard that term? Like people who just watch The Office endlessly on a loop, or me, I watch 30 Rock. I'm always in the middle of some kind of rewatch just because I know how it's going to go. I know what it all means, man. I know what it signifies, and it feels good to me. And so that's like a sort of teddy bear you're taking into the world. And if it's in the poem, yeah, it's creating some safety, I think.
Yeah. For me, that's like murder mysteries set on the coast of Ireland or England.
You're the exact person to write about the Demogorgon, if that is your comfort TV. That's amazing.
It is very comforting. Like just a good-natured British murder.
I guess I can't complain because I'm like, oh, I'll take myself to the movies and see some gory horror film for fun and comfort and pleasure.
Yeah, you watch horror movies like that. I don't do this.
I do.
Yeah.
Well,
I mean, what do you think? Like when you use pop culture in your poems, like, do you feel a sense of protection? Do you feel like it's a way into something that you might not be able to access? Or
yeah, it's definitely a kind of rhetorical shorthand in some cases, for sure. And I think there is, I mean, the element of protection, I think that's something new that you're teaching me in this moment that I'm thinking about. And I think it feels really true to me. But I do think that it just, to me, has never, ever made sense to empirically just divorce poetry from everything else in our lives. And what's in our lives in 21st century America is pop culture, among many other things. Yes, there are beaches and dogs and political strife, but there's also what's on TV. And I've always been interested in that and writing about pop culture and writing that takes it seriously. And I kind of had that bred out of me for a long time through the academy, through my MFA program, my PhD program. It wasn't serious enough, but I mean, the longer I sort of labored in that environment, the more I felt that it did not make sense to me, that it's not as if pop culture like grows on trees naturally and we just pluck it and enjoy it. It's created by people, and anything that people create is worth studying to me, even if you don't like it or it's bad or it's schlocky or it's the same as some other thing you saw. It's still a cultural product that we made, and it's fascinating to me.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I also want to campaign for poetry being pop culture.
That's well, I think, I don't know, I'm not a fortune teller, but I would hope that it's going that way. I mean, that there is poetry at all on the shelf at Target. There's poetry books. Maybe it's not your favorite kind of poetry, but it's there. And that's wild. It's wild to me, you know? Yeah. I think it's interesting, and I think it's worth tracking. I hope that I am tracking things that are really going to be continue to develop. I think it's worth taking anything seriously that people take seriously, you know? I want to talk a little bit more about some more of your Demogorgon poems. They're also amazing. I think by my count, there are 5 in the book, and there are a couple, let's see. I think there are a couple, oh yes, these are just so wonderful. The last 3 all kind of tie together in a story. So would you mind talking a little bit about Portrait of Demogorgon as Poet? Because that brings in, it's not only in the form of a poem, it is about poets and poetry explicitly. One thing I love about the way you use popular culture is that you are not afraid to make it work for you, to shape it into things that matter for your book. And like the Demogorgon of Stranger Things is not explicitly a poet, but you are situating it in this way where you can see it in that manner. So tell me a little bit about that poem.
Yeah, I was kind of playing around in this book with the idea of self-portrait, which is something we see a lot in poetry. But like thinking about like what are some surprising ways to like challenge that, or like create portraits that are unlikely, where I'm like projecting myself into someone else's like realm, I guess. Should I read this one?
Yeah, would you read it? I was gonna ask you, please.
Yeah. Okay. Portrait of Demogorgon as Poet. The Prince of Demons attends a writers' conference. He travels all the way from the 88th abyss to some woods in America. The Prince of Demons doesn't forget his weed and his condoms, which are only for show. He plans to impregnate everyone. He is workshopping his poem about Ferguson, which he heard about on human TV. The Prince of Demons' perspective on this matter is very important because hate makes him blush in a good way. Anyway, his poem has a megaphone, so he hears nothing but his own voice. His poem makes the workshop feel afraid. To avoid a violent flaying, not critiquing the Prince of Demons' poems is advised. In his one mind, the Prince of Demons wants so badly to be good, or at least liked. But a softy monster never got anywhere, as his father the king used to say. At the craft lecture, the Prince of Demons doodles little drawings of light bulbs and naked women. He sits mostly alone at dinner, shaking his head, chuckling to himself, face unfurling like a corpse flower, exposing his many sharp teeth. Fools, he thinks, all of them fools. Don't they know Voltaire named him creator of earth, that Milton dreaded him, that he is Melville's white whale, that his very name is taboo? He cries like a man-goat and closes his face as a fist. There, demon prince. It's not your fault. It is we who opened the portal, who brought you here in the first place. It's because we worshipped you that you grew so strong?
Mm. It is we who open the portal. I love that. Can you talk a little bit about what that action means to you?
Yeah, I mean, the veil of metaphor is very thin.
Well, when you have a creature, I mean, I love when you describe it so visually. Even somebody who had no idea what was going on can grasp onto this, but closes his face as a fist. That is such a productive, dare I say, male kind of image, masculine image. It's not your fault that the veil is so thin. It's right there on the surface.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, okay, it is we who opened the portal. You know, what I'm thinking about in the lines of the poem, and again, I'm like trying to extend some kind of empathy or some kind of understanding, because I think it's easy to get angry at the structures of power, especially if we're being held back by them in some way. And I think that, like, in the writing world, we see that a lot, right? Like, so there's this idea, you know, we were kind of touching on this earlier. Our professors teach us not to write about pop culture, right? Who are our professors? Well, largely, for me, white, cis, het, male poets.
Yeah, for me too.
They're thinking about what is, and they're thinking, I mean, most of our professors are the same.
The same professor.
Like, what they're doing is they're doing this thing where they're thinking about what is universal. But what is universal is white and male, and it is only accessible to people in positions of power because of the structures of power. Like, we have traditionally in the Western canon, I think, we or they or whatever have set up this thing where it's like, you have one layer of like oppression or marginalization, then I can no longer access your poem. So like, I had a professor tell me, like, well, if your speaker was male, I could access this poem, right?
Yeah.
And you know that story. And then, you know, and then I think like the further, like the more oppressed we are in terms of like our representation or our marginalization, like the less your work becomes universal, which is just classist and racist and misogynist bullshit.
Right.
And so what I'm thinking about is like, it is we who open the portal. It is, you know, we're all participating in these systems of power. And when I think about like my young experience as a young writer, like upholding a lot of men, and oftentimes a lot of bad men in positions of power, who were telling us what to write, who were saying, if you reference pop culture in your poetry, you are no longer universal, you are no longer accessible. But what about, like, where is the complaint against the white cis het male poet, where we say, you know what, I'm not white and I'm not male, so I can't access your poems? Sure. No, because they're in the utmost position of power. Like, they are universal, they are accessible to everyone.
Yeah.
And like, you know, and that's what I'm thinking about. Like, we participate in upholding those structures.
Yeah, because we worshipped you. You grew so strong. Yeah.
And I mean that, that privilege, which I feel very privileged in a lot of ways in my education and my access to it. Like, I'm participating in upholding that. So no, it's not just the monster. It's everyone who worships the monster.
That's amazing. I love that answer. It reminds me of a recent post where I was writing about sort of the cult of relatability, as a valued cultural descriptor, and who's it relatable to, or why, or should that ever be the purpose of art, to be relatable?
What does that teach us?
Nothing. I mean, I really started to think about it seriously when I was teaching at the University of North Texas, and there would be this murmur that would go around the creative writing workshop that my students were in. And they would be like, that's really relatable, man. And everyone would go, yeah, it's relatable, really relatable, totally relatable. And I know that was not true. They were all very different from one another. And it just seemed like this golden thing that you were after, the coveted relatability. but it leaves people out, you know? What does it have to be relatable? What if it's not relatable? What if your experience, Jenny, is not relatable to anyone?
Right. And like, I don't know what we learn from just saying like, you know, I mean, this is what I try to steer my students away from a workshop. Like, this poem reminds me of my dad. So
yeah, exactly.
What does that teach you? Or like, maybe what's relatable is the emotional truth. But what if you don't recognize yourself in the speaker or anyone in the poem or the land of the poem or the place of the poem or the situation? Like, none of that matters. What does matter is the relatability of the human experience of it. But I think what happens with like, don't write about pop culture is it's an othering thing. And it's like, it's problematic.
Yeah. I think it's also an attempt to classify poets, like you said, you know, but I think you've done an amazing job with popular culture. You also you have these poems where quote unquote high culture and low culture collide. You have poems where Ophelia of Hamlet fame is involved in these Demogorgon poems. So you're it's like a crossover episode, and the other 3 poems in your book that deal with the Demogorgon have Ophelia in them. Can you talk about how Ophelia appeared in this book and then why she ends up hanging out with the Demogorgon?
Yeah, okay, so Ophelia, okay. You know, I talked a little bit about 11 and my fascination and recognition in the 11 character. And then at the time I was writing these poems, I was reading, I don't remember how I got into this, but I was reading I don't know, maybe I was purposely trying to make myself mad. I was reading like irrelevant dead white men scholars.
It's the thing that poets do, they just make themselves angry.
And one of them said, without Hamlet, Ophelia has no story. Mm-hmm. And I've always been interested in Ophelia, and not necessarily like Ophelia on the page. I've been interested in what is not said about Ophelia. Like, ever since I first read Hamlet, and then in teaching Hamlet, like I'm more and more interested. I'm like, where is her mother?
Where's like mother?
Where's your mother in all this? Like, that, you know, that's just never addressed. Or like what is this madness? Like, you know, and what is Hamlet doing to you? Because I started to recognize the more like I went through life that Hamlet's gaslighting Ophelia. And so then anyway, what I did was I took the play and I took all of Ophelia's lines out and I just wrote them on their own. And then I was like, oh, okay, yes.
It's like the room was finally quiet and you could hear her.
Yeah. And there's a poem in the book that is just made up. It's also a Dungeons and Dragons reference where Ophelia rolls the 20-sided die, and it's just 20 of her lines in an order that I think, actually they're in chronological order to the play, but they're telling that story of gaslighting.
Amazing.
And anyway, so I felt like, I'm like, what if and not that this has never been done before, I realize that this is like a large trope in literature and art, but like, what if I empowered Ophelia? And like, what if there's like a life beyond the pond? What if she, you know, what if she gets out? Like, what next for her? Like, how would she empower herself? Like post Hamlet Ophelia, what does that look like? So, and the Demogorgon being this figure of toxic masculinity, I don't know, I just started to sort of play with like moving characters around, and they wound up together. And I thought it was kind of interesting to think about like the Demogorgon as like a courtly prince too.
I love that. I was
also kind of making myself laugh during the whole thing.
I think that's great. I think that's how you really know you're on to something, is you're just delighting yourself.
Yeah.
In one way or the other.
Having fun.
Will you read an Ophelia Demogorgon poem of your choosing? They're also amazing. I mean, the titles tell a really good story. Ophelia meets Demogorgon. Demogorgon tries Ophelia for witchcraft. That's how the story always goes. And then Ophelia slays Demogorgon. What part of that journey is the most interesting to you?
I think maybe, I mean, do you have a preference? Like, I don't,
I think maybe I would love to have you read Ophelia Meets Demogorgon, because she's literally fresh out of the pond.
Yes.
In the first line.
Yeah, okay.
The story continues with your poem most directly.
Yeah, so she has like sort of escaped her own situation of suicide, which was orchestrated by men, right? And here she is. Okay, Ophelia meets Demogorgon. I'm also imagining Cracker Barrel in this poem.
That is a new detail for me that I'm really excited about.
I always think about Cracker Barrel.
I can't wait.
Ophelia meets Demogorgon. Dress still dripping. Ophelia rocks in a white wood chair at the roadside diner, counting all her vengeances. There's fennel for you and columbines a down, she chuckles. She enjoys a good gin cocktail, takes the stones from her pockets, arranges them in a star at her feet. She's alone. It's delicious. In the trees, she hears some rustling and a face like a flower emerges. A face she's never seen before. Something for her collection, she thinks. This reptilian bloom face, attached to a lithe man-like body, saunters toward her as an insect on its wiry legs. She is not afraid, woods glazed in a gimlet haze, and the worst, she thinks, is behind her. The petals of his face fold back, and there is something wondrous in all those shining teeth, in all those ligaments and ribs. A large black lightning cloud descends over the woods, and Demogorgon kneels before her, picks up a stone, and swallows it whole. This deference, this act resembling knightly duty, excites her.
I love that poem. It's so immersive. And now I know that I can be immersed in a Cracker Barrel in the first section of the poem. But that's where you would go, right? If you're just dropped off in the middle of nowhere, you'd walk towards the road, which would be some highway, which would have some Cracker Barrel on it.
Presumably, and they always have those rocking chairs.
I love this one so much. I think, so I mean, you've mashed up two worlds here. You've delighted yourself with this meeting. But this seems like a revelation to Ophelia, and that things are going to get better from here on out.
Mm-hmm.
But they don't, right?
Yeah. I think that, when she's thinking about collecting him, I was trying to empower her in a way that, like, she, in the play in Hamlet, she's so used and manipulated and, I don't know, two-dimensional, I guess you might say.
Right.
And so I was hoping that, like, here, she does have to battle this Demogorgon. She does have to, like, have a reckoning. But it's also like Hamlet has sort of prepared her for this, like, larger battle, which when she completes it, like, she will become transcendent in a way. So I feel like she's already strong. She's already like repossessed her potential suicide. And
yeah, she feels stronger. You're right. I think, yeah, there's definitely, I can feel the Dungeons and Dragons energy sort of coursing. She's like a experienced player. She's ready. She's ready for her next challenge.
Yeah. She's almost ready to be a dungeon master.
That's amazing. Well, I love this book, and everybody who doesn't own it should own it. If you thought that poetry, if you're watching this or reading this post and you thought that poetry was some type of way, there is Dungeons and Dragons in poetry. There are demogorgons. There are references to Shakespeare, sure, but there's other things too. There's life. And I'm always just so fascinated by what contemporary poets are doing with pop culture, especially my favorite poet, you, Jenny Molberg, what you're doing with pop culture. Can you identify for me how, like, usual this is for you, or how normal to include popular culture in your book? Do you have other engagements with it, or is your first book interested in that? I know you may or may not have another book in the works. What's your relationship to it, like, more broadly? What does it take to get something to cross over into poetry land for you?
So as you know, and we've kind of talked about it, we were students together, and kind of taught out of this And also I have this like recollection of being told numerous times that my writing was masculine, and that was a compliment.
Cool.
So like write yourself out, like write yourself toward the male, right? And I think that, you know, for that reason, I think when I was like journaling or I was having fun by myself, I'm always invested in pop culture. Like I've always been, I watch way too much TV, and like I'm interested in film and music. And
yeah, I know our friendship has involved a lot of
debate,
Frasier and pop culture excursions. Yeah.
Like which is better, 30 Rock or Parks and Rec was like a years long debate.
Now I'm kind of on your side, so yeah.
But no, I think that it was kind of taught out of me, and I didn't think that that's what poetry was supposed to be. And I think for a long time I didn't think that was what poetry was supposed to be, but it was always my impulse. So in my first book, I was doing like sort of pop science.
Right.
Like, so I did like pop science of the 18th.
An eyeball on it, you know? Yeah.
So there's like pop science of the 18th and 19th centuries in that book. And I say pop because like a lot of it was like found in letters and things like that. And then like Carl Sagan and, you know, stuff like that I was interested in. Now with my third book that's officially coming out, I just got word.
Yay! You heard it here first.
And I think it'll be February 2023, but I'm not necessarily engaging in pop culture, but I am engaging in true crime in a lot of ways, which in some ways has become kind of pop culture.
Yeah, the genre. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's kind of another enormous conversation. I don't want to crack that open, but
we'll crack it open when that book comes out, and you'll just
come
back and it'll be good.
Yeah. So I think the impulse is there. I think it's just like, you know, for a while I was scared about it, but I think once we got away from the academy, I mean, I do teach at a university, but I like to be able to challenge those things. And I think once I got away from being a student and thinking like, oh wait, I don't actually have, like, these rules are arbitrary, I don't actually have to follow them. And I'm actually really interested in a lot of poetry that engages with pop culture. Let's see what happens, you know?
Yeah. I think that, you know, part of the fascination for me and the reason that I started this project with the Substack and everything is that I would just always get really pumped when I saw poetry out in the world, or whatever, the real world, out in popular culture, because it felt so remote, so sort of niche to me. That it was on TV or in a movie or in a song was always super exciting to me since I was a kid. And so, you know, I think that fascination will never go away from me, and I'm going to try to channel it into something positive. But I would like to see it sort of more, and I'm always happy to see it when I do. And I was wondering if you could tell me if there is some pop culture element, some pop culture item that you would love to see turn up. And oh wait, no, I wanted to ask you the reverse of that question. Actually, if you could see some poetry involve some popular culture, what would you hope to see? Would you hope to be the person writing it, or is there some like dream project you could dream up of some poet that would make something involving popular culture that you would love? Or, you know,
what I wrote down was I want to see a book about Star Trek by Aaron Adair Hodges.
That's amazing.
Who is the biggest Star Trek nerd I know.
If Aaron is watching this, you've had your challenge issued. You need to write a book about Star Trek.
Come on, Aaron.
Not you? You're not going to write it?
I might write a Star Trek poem. I mean, I've talked to you a little bit about like what I'm working on right now, which is like sort of a tribute to the 80s and 90s. I think there's going to be a lot of pop culture. I was just working on a draft earlier today about Lorena Bobbitt, which like,
oh my God.
Is that pop culture?
And when you really start to explode the category out, it's like, you know, these moments of culture, headlines, news items. Yeah, that name.
Like stories like Lorena, that pops up in pop culture all the time. Like,
yeah, it's sort of like a meme, like a referent. Yeah.
Yeah. And like, let's like deconstruct those jokes that have been made on TV and like, you know.
So interesting. I really want to read that. I also would read Aaron's book about Star Trek. I mean, we're just saying. What do you think makes Star Trek good fodder for poetry? What's one element that it has?
Well, actually, like, I mean, it's so many. I could go on and on. I think that if you think about like all the alien species in that show, like there's a lot of social commentary happening, and a lot of like
brilliant,
right? And there's a lot of like stuff that's happening between like with Data, right? Like the one episode where Data feels feelings.
It already almost is a poem.
It is.
Yeah.
I mean, Whoopi Goldberg as the bartender, like there's so much poetry.
I'm ready for that. I mean, especially because you're looking at it and you're not saying, I want to write a poem about Star Trek because I like Star Trek. You're saying it's because you see something in it. You see something deeper than the surface of the show, and you're trying to excavate that. Mm-hmm. That to me feels infinitely worthy, you know?
And I always think of like comedy and poetry being like super close together, because like we're laughing because like there's something really serious and sad often, and like vice versa, you know, like, and the punchline is like the arrival of a poem, you know, like it's,
you have to have a common understanding in comedy before you make a punchline.
Yeah, there's a recognition, and there's a conversation happening. And I feel like when we start, I mean, we can laugh, like, and it is funny, like we can laugh at these things about Star Trek, which like a lot of it was so silly, but it was actually like, sometimes took itself seriously. And I think that's interesting, that kind of like, I love that space between like comedy and like social commentary or like tragedy, where it's like, which is, investigate that.
Have you seen the Bo Burnham special Inside?
Yeah.
I feel like that's occupying that space where, and he openly invites that question of, can anybody make a joke right now when things are so terrible? And then he goes, yeah, sure, why not?
Yeah, you know? We have to. That's exactly when we have to.
But he continues to make commentary. So I think that, I think that's, I'm really delighted to see genres like that crop up that are sort of interested in those things. Yeah.
Have you seen this book, Pilot? Danica Stegman LeMay, and I hope I'm pronouncing that right.
No, I haven't. I don't think so, no.
The whole book is about Lost, the TV show.
Oh, okay.
And I haven't read the whole book yet. Yeah, I have a review copy. I haven't read the whole book yet. We did have a review of it in Pleiades.
That's fantastic. Okay, I gotta check that out. Thank you.
That's one. And then have you read, the other one I was thinking about is Hotel Almighty, which I just read. So it's Sarah Sloat, and it's, the whole thing is based on Misery by Stephen King, but it's erasures.
Yes to all of that. Yes to all.
That whole like Kathy Bates, like in Misery, is a joke, you know, and it has been a joke for so long, and it's like very deeply investigating like what that means. And it's cool.
Bring it all to me. I love this. I love this so much. My last question is whether or not you have a favorite poem or poet that appears in popular culture. I finally got it right. Whether you have a piece of media that contains poetry that you love or that you were excited by, and what about its appearance delighted you?
You wrote about it.
I did. I was like secretly hoping you would like give me some more material.
Oh, damn.
My insane spreadsheet that I have, but
okay, I'll brainstorm more, but it's Parks and Rec, Ron Swanson reading Robert Burns and stuff.
Poetry for Men. Oh my God. I have loved that. Oh my gosh. Why do you love it?
You know, I was thinking about that because I was like, you know, like, because the answer is not because like, oh, you're such a man and poetry makes you soft, you know, because like that's kind of the joke of it. But I think that there's something serious behind that, which is like, because Ron Swanson is a joke of the trope of a masculine man.
It's got layers. Yeah.
Yeah. And so I think that like, so then the trope would be that he would read poetry and be moved.
Yeah.
But there's still that like meta layer that they're doing, I think, in Parks and Rec.
Yeah. Where
it's like, you're not surprised that Ron Swanson has that depth.
But he's surprised that he does a little bit. Yeah. I really like to watch his face after he reads it, and then he looks right at the camera, and I still really struggle to describe what his face is doing when he says, well, I don't know what she thought I'd get out of that. But he's clearly experiencing something And it's a very old poem, you know.
Yeah.
It's a deep cut. It's not, you know,
It's a deep cut.
It's a deep cut. And
oh, where my love, yon lilac fair.
Yeah. I think it's interesting because Leslie's always trying to find ways to connect and communicate with people. And she's using the poem as a communication with Ron, because he's sort of insensate to all of her more overt, I love you, my dear friends.
Mm-hmm.
So she sends Robert Burns in her absence to sort of.
And I love that it is kind of like, it's an uber romantic gesture. And there's some like, I don't know, this is a whole conversation or a whole essay or something. I mean, you wrote about this, but I feel like there's some like distancing that can be created with like an uber romantic gesture versus like a personal conversation.
Yeah. Maybe the Friends episode where Ross fills Rachel's desk with an obscene quantity of love plus love plus love does not always equal more love. It equals distance in some way. That's interesting.
It's a little bit of love bombing.
Love bomb. Yeah. Leslie loves to love bomb. Leslie Knope.
She does. But Ron, it means something. I mean, because Ron is all about like rootedness and place and like history.
Which is totally the stuff of poetry.
It is.
He's anti-art. He has the Jack Donaghy vibe, where Jack says, we know what art is. It's paintings of horses. That's all that art is to a guy like that, supposedly. So yeah, it's really interesting to watch him grapple with that. I just want
I think the only, sorry.
No, please go ahead.
Oh no, and then, I was just thinking about like, I know that there are so many references, but one of my all-time favorites, which is not even just a reference, it's a whole film, but is Dead Poets Society.
It's coming. And the only reason it's not already here is because where does one start? It is
Sweaty Tooth Madman.
Yeah, right. Yeah. That, because a lot of the movie is about teaching.
And it's about relating what seems like high inaccessible art to living.
Yeah. And I think too, a lot of it is about teaching the value of poetry and literature. And that moment is about creating poetry and engaging them that way.
But I love that he's just being asked to describe Walt Whitman. Like he's a sweaty tooth madman.
Right.
And I feel like
I've got a Whitman post coming.
Ooh.
Very soon.
What's the Whitman reference? Where is it?
You're going to be disappointed. There's so much Whitman coming for lots of reasons, but the first one is going to be a bummer for you. It's a misquoting, a misidentification of Whitman in Ted Lasso. He quotes Walt Whitman, and that's not a thing Walt Whitman ever said. So that's interesting. Yeah.
I've only seen the first 3 episodes of Ted Lasso, so I don't.
Well, season 2 is coming on July 23rd, so you can pick up pop poetry then. But I'm also looking at Breaking Bad and Whitman extensively. That's gonna take multiple attempts for lots of Whitman.
Are there a lot of Whitman references in Breaking Bad?
It's just that there's one poem that ends up being really significant in a lot of different ways. The Learned Astronomer. It comes back a lot. And there's poetry too. I don't know, way back when they used to use Shelley to advertise Breaking Bad.
Really?
They used to. There's a video I'm going to link to, of course, but it's on YouTube of Bryan Cranston reading Ozymandias in a voiceover for a promotional video for Breaking Bad, just about a king who has fallen and all of those things. So. There's lots of poetry.
There's also that Joe Biden video of him reading Seamus Heaney.
That's on my list, and that's you were asking me a minute ago, what's popular culture? And presidential interventions with poetry are on my list, and I've been thinking about whether they fit, and I think they do in some ways. Yeah. Amanda Gorman really just exploded into the national consciousness. There have been very few inaugural poets. It seems like a thing we should always have or have always had, but we haven't. It's been very few. And
if you think about the concept of like what popular culture means, though, like think of like I saw so many people posting this, and also people in my family being like, wasn't Amanda Gorman amazing? Like people who don't read my poetry, who are in my family, are like, how about that Amanda Gorman? And I'm like, yeah, absolutely. But it's that stage that I think makes.
And I'm interested too in the many loud and incorrect voices that said that she was not a poet.
Oh, yeah.
That's really telling, I think, of where we're at culturally with our understanding of what it is and can be, and who.
Nobody who said that is not a poet. So those people who said that are the gatekeepers who we must destroy.
I agree with you, Jenny, and I want to talk to you all night, and I'm going to probably after I turn off this recording. But I want to ask you while we're recording, what's next for you? Where can we find out more about your work? What are you working on? I know you mentioned the third book, you mentioned another project. What can we learn about where to get more of you if we're loving your work?
Okay, I have a website.
Awesome.
It's just jennymolberg.com. Or you can follow me on Twitter, and I think it's just at Jenny Molberg. Yes, this book is from LSU Press. You can find it in your local bookstores. That's Refusal. My next book will come out in 2023. I had a little essay in Oprah Quarterly.
Oh, just a little thing in Oprah.
It's short.
Really good though.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm trying to work on some more essays. It's hard for me, but I'm working on it.
Well, whatever you're working on, I want to know about it. I'll link to your book on the site and everything. Thank you so much for talking with me and for being my friend and for putting all your beautiful work out into the world.
Thank you so much for having me and being my friend. This is a really cool conversation.
Yay.
We appreciate you.
It won't be the last time.
Better not be.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.